London, 1815. The soft glow of candlelight illuminated the modest dressing room as Eliza Thornfield secured the final silk ribbon in her sister Rebecca's golden curls. At 26, Eliza had long since abandoned the flutter of excitement that once accompanied such preparations. While Rebecca, barely 18 and blessed with the family's legendary beauty, chatted enthusiastically about the evening ahead, Eliza allowed her thoughts to wander. The familiar lecture from Aunt Lady Montgomery punctured her reverie as the formidable matron swept into the room, her critical gaze assessing both sisters with practiced efficiency. "Your gown is too simple, Eliza," she declared, fingering the modest blue silk with disapproval. "This is likely your last season to secure a match. At your age, men expect a woman to make some effort." Eliza nodded politely, having grown accustomed to such admonishments over the years. Her aunt was not being unkind, merely practical. After 8 seasons without a proposal, despite her respectable lineage and modest dowry, Eliza had earned the whispered designation of being on the shelf. Her crime was not merely her advancing age, but her unfortunate habit of speaking her mind in a society that prized demure silence in its young ladies, coupled with features that, while pleasant, lacked the breathtaking impact of her sister's beauty. The looking-glass reflected this truth without mercy. Dark chestnut hair pulled back in a simple style, intelligent hazel eyes that revealed too much of her thoughts, and a mouth too often curved in ironic observation rather than flattering smiles. As Rebecca twirled before them, exclaiming over the effect of her ivory satin against her perfect complexion, Eliza caught sight of their surroundings in the mirror. Thornfield House had once been among the finest residences in this fashionable London square. Now, the keen observer might notice the faded draperies, the carpets worn thin in high-traffic areas, and the subtle absence of silver trinkets that had gradually disappeared to pay mounting debts. Their father, the late Viscount Thornfield, had left them with little beyond an illustrious name. Eliza was under no illusions about her situation. Without beauty or fortune, her chances of marriage grew slimmer with each passing season. Her practical nature had already adjusted to this reality, filling her days with scholarly pursuits and botanical studies that brought her genuine pleasure, if not social advancement. "Do try to smile tonight, Eliza," Lady Montgomery instructed, adjusting her own elaborate turban. "The Harrington ball will be attended by several eligible bachelors. Perhaps if you refrained from discussing your unusual interests, you might yet attract some gentleman of moderate means." Eliza promised compliance, knowing she would likely end the evening in a quiet corner with the few matrons who appreciated her conversation. As the carriage was announced, she gathered her shawl, mentally preparing herself for another evening of polite rejection and social invisibility. Such was the lot of a plain, intelligent woman in want of fortune, and Eliza Thornfield had learned to bear it with quiet dignity. The morning after the Harrington ball dawned grey and damp, a typical London spring day that matched Eliza's subdued mood. The previous evening had unfolded exactly as anticipated. Rebecca had been surrounded by admirers while Eliza had spent most of the night discussing the merits of various translations of Homer with an elderly scholar who had seemed grateful for her company. She was in the morning room cataloguing plant specimens she had collected from the small garden behind their townhouse, when the sound of excited voices drew her attention. Lady Montgomery burst into the room, waving a cream-colored envelope bearing an elaborate wax seal, her face flushed with excitement in a manner Eliza had not witnessed in years. "A miracle has occurred," she announced, pressing one hand dramatically to her heart. "The Duke of Ravencroft has invited us to stay at Blackwood Manor for a fortnight. Us, specifically, by name." "The Duke of Ravencroft," Eliza repeated, the pressed flower in her hand momentarily forgotten. "But we haven't seen Alexander in 15 years. Why would he invite us now?" Lady Montgomery was too preoccupied with the implications of such an invitation to notice Eliza's use of the Duke's given name. The young Duke has been notably absent from London society since assuming the title 5 years ago, appearing only when duty demanded it. His vast fortune and handsome features had made him the most sought-after bachelor in England, despite his reputation for being reserved to the point of coldness. Rebecca entered the room, still in her morning gown, her golden curls tumbling around her shoulders. "What invitation, Aunt?" she inquired, stifling a yawn. When Lady Montgomery explained, Rebecca's blue eyes widened with interest. "A duke?" she breathed. "Certainly the most advantageous match we could hope for." Lady Montgomery nodded vigorously, already envisioning her younger niece as a duchess. "We shall need new gowns immediately." The Duke remembers our family connection from years ago, clearly. What a blessing your father was his godfather, though the connection has been sadly neglected since his death. As her aunt and sister immediately launched into plans for an appropriate wardrobe, Eliza found herself transported back 15 years, to summers spent at Blackwood Manor before her father's financial troubles had forced them to limit their social circle. She remembered a serious boy with thoughtful grey eyes who had shared her interest in botany, who had shown her secret corners of the vast gardens where rare specimens grew. Young Alexander had been her dearest friend during those golden summers, the only person who had never seemed to find her love of books and plants peculiar. They had been inseparable until his father, the old Duke, had deemed it inappropriate for his heir to spend so much time with a girl and had sent Alexander to boarding school. Their correspondence had continued briefly, filled with botanical observations and discussions of books they had both read, until it too had been discovered and forbidden. Eliza had not seen him since she was 11 years old. Now he was the Duke, and she was a spinster with fading prospects. Why would he remember her after all these years? The question tugged at her mind as she fingered the invitation. Lady Montgomery interrupted her thoughts. What a stroke of fortune for Rebecca. The Duke must be looking for a bride, and to specifically invite us suggests he remembers the connection between our families. Do you recall him at all, Eliza? He was several years older than you. Eliza nodded absently, unwilling to share the depth of her memories with her aunt. I remember him somewhat. He was kind. But as her aunt and sister continued their excited planning, Eliza could not suppress a small flutter of anticipation. Perhaps Alexander remembered their friendship too. The journey to Blackwood Manor took 2 days by carriage, the gentle rolling hills of Hampshire gradually giving way to more dramatic landscapes as they approached the Duke of Ravencroft's ancestral seat. Eliza found herself pressed against the window as the imposing structure finally came into view, its Gothic spires reaching toward a leaden sky that threatened rain. The manor sprawled across the hillside like a slumbering beast, ancient and formidable, its grey stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Ivy climbed possessively up the eastern facade, partially obscuring mullioned windows that reflected no light, while gargoyles peered down from the roofline as if judging the newcomers approaching their domain. Lady Montgomery and Rebecca exclaimed appropriately over the grandeur, but Eliza found herself searching for the gardens she remembered, catching glimpses of manicured hedges and formal pathways beyond the gravel drive. As the carriage rolled to a stop before the broad stone steps, the massive oak doors swung open to reveal a tall figure, silhouetted against the warm light from within. The Duke descended the steps as footmen rushed to attend to the carriage, his movements fluid and controlled. Eliza felt her breath catch in her throat as she truly saw Alexander for the first time in 15 years. The laughing boy she remembered had been replaced by a man of imposing presence, his broad shoulders encased in a perfectly tailored coat of dark blue, his raven hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble for all the warmth it displayed. Only his eyes remained unchanged, that peculiar shade of grey that reminded Eliza of storm clouds gathering over the sea. Lady Montgomery and Rebecca dipped into their most elegant curtsies as the Duke greeted them with formal politeness, but when his gaze fell upon Eliza, something flickered in those stormy eyes. A flash of recognition swiftly concealed. Miss Thornfield, he said, his deep voice sending an unexpected shiver along her spine as he took her gloved hand. It has been many years. I find myself pleased to discover you still have an interest in botany, if the specimens carefully pressed between the pages of your letters were any indication. Eliza stared at him in surprise, colour warming her cheeks at the realization that he had not only remembered their childhood friendship, but had also kept her letters. I confess I am surprised you recall such details, Your Grace, she replied, finding her voice at last. The ghost of a smile touched his lips, transforming his severe features momentarily. "I recall a great many details about our acquaintance, Miss Thornfield." The first drops of rain began to fall as he led them into the great hall, the portraits of stern Ravencroft ancestors watching their progress with painted disapproval. Lady Montgomery and Rebecca exchanged meaningful glances at the Duke's particular attention to Eliza, their expressions a mixture of confusion and calculation. A footman appeared to guide them to their rooms, but not before Alexander informed them that he had instructed his head gardener to show Eliza the newly restored conservatory at her convenience. "Perhaps you might share your expert opinion on our collection of rare orchids," he suggested, his tone making it more command than request. As they followed the servant up the grand staircase, Eliza became aware of Rebecca's curious gaze and Lady Montgomery's calculating assessment. The unexpected warmth of the Duke's welcome, directed so specifically toward her rather than her beautiful sister, had upset all their expectations, introducing an element of unpredictability that made Eliza both apprehensive and oddly exhilarated. Perhaps Alexander truly did remember their friendship with fondness. The thought brought a small smile to her lips as she glanced back at his tall figure standing in the hall below, his eyes still following her progress with an intensity that suggested their reunion was far from coincidental. The grand dining room of Blackwood Manor glowed with the light of 100 candles, their soft illumination reflecting off the polished silver and crystal that adorned the massive oak table stretching beneath an ornate chandelier. Eliza's practiced eye noted that while the settings were elegant, they lacked ostentation, suggesting the Duke preferred refined simplicity to gaudy display. The company assembled for dinner included several neighbors of consequence, most notably Lady Harrington and her 3 daughters, each more beautiful than the last, and Mrs. Pembroke with her niece, a striking young woman whose fashionable gown of crimson silk made Eliza's modest blue appear particularly plain by comparison. Lady Montgomery had been visibly disappointed when Rebecca had been seated far from the Duke, while Eliza found herself placed unexpectedly near him at the table. Though separated by the eldest Miss Harrington, whose golden curls and tinkling laughter seemed designed to capture masculine attention. Throughout the first courses, Eliza observed the Duke as discreetly as possible, noting how he answered each attempt at flirtation with perfect politeness, that nonetheless maintained an unmistakable distance. His intelligence was evident in his conversation, his responses thoughtful rather than merely conventional, while the respect shown to him by the assembled company spoke to his authority as both landlord and nobleman. The other young ladies employed every art of feminine charm in their attempts to engage him, from demurely lowered lashes to strategically displayed accomplishments. Miss Pembroke mentioned her proficiency at the pianoforte no fewer than 3 times, while the youngest Miss Harrington contrived to drop her fan so that the Duke might gallantly retrieve it. Eliza, by contrast, remained quietly attentive, speaking only when directly addressed and feeling increasingly invisible among the beauty and vivacity surrounding her. She had just resigned herself to an evening of polite insignificance when the conversation turned unexpectedly to literature. Miss Harrington proclaimed her admiration for the Romantic poets, particularly Lord Byron, whose brooding heroes she found most appealing. The Duke listened with a neutral expression before turning suddenly to Eliza. "And you, Miss Thornfield?" he inquired, his grey eyes intent upon her face. "Do you share Miss Harrington's enthusiasm for Byron, or do you perhaps prefer a different poet entirely?" The direct question, asked with genuine interest rather than mere politeness, caught Eliza by surprise. She was conscious of curious glances from the other guests, particularly Lady Harrington, whose expressions suggested she found the Duke's interest in a spinster most peculiar. "I admire Byron's skills, certainly," Eliza replied carefully, "but I confess I find more truth in Wordsworth's celebration of nature than in Byron's glorification of melancholy. Poetry should illuminate the world around us, not merely the turmoil within." Alexander leaned forward slightly, a spark of genuine interest animating his features. "An interesting perspective, Miss Thornfield. Would you then argue that the external world holds more poetic possibility than the landscape of human emotion?" Eliza met his gaze directly, temporarily forgetting the watchful eyes of the company. "I would argue rather that the greatest poetry finds the connection between the two, Your Grace. Wordsworth's daffodils are not merely flowers, but vessels of joy that nourish the soul in empty moments. Lady Harrington attempted to reclaim the Duke's attention by mentioning her daughter's extensive library, but Alexander remained focused on Eliza, engaging her in a spirited debate about the merits of various poets that soon had the entire table listening in fascination. Eliza found herself defending Blake against his criticism, her natural eloquence emerging as she forgot her usual reserve. By the time the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, leaving the gentlemen to their port, Eliza was conscious of speculative glances and whispered comments. Lady Montgomery appeared torn between confusion and calculation, while the Harrington sisters regarded Eliza with newly assessing eyes. Rebecca squeezed her sister's hand as they processed from the dining room. "It seems the Duke finds you interesting, Eliza," she whispered. "How extraordinary." Eliza had no response to this, for she found it extraordinary herself. The memory of Alexander's animated expression as they debated, so different from his usual reserve, lingered pleasantly in her mind, along with the unsettling awareness that his interest had awoken something long dormant within her, a dangerous spark of hope that she had thought extinguished years ago. Dawn cast a pearly light across the gardens of Blackwood Manor as Eliza slipped quietly through the French doors of the morning room, eager to explore the grounds before the household stirred. She had dressed simply in a walking gown of sage green, her hair secured in a practical knot at the nape of her neck, with sturdy half-boots that Lady Montgomery would have deemed entirely unsuitable for a young lady seeking matrimonial advancement. The air held the sweet freshness that follows rain, and dew sparkled on every surface, transforming spiderwebs into diamond necklaces draped across hedges and turning ordinary leaves into collections of liquid jewels. Eliza breathed deeply, savoring the earthy perfume of damp soil and green-growing things as she followed a gravelled path that wound between formal parterres and artfully arranged shrubbery. Her steps quickened as she recognized landmarks from her childhood visits, the marble folly, the ornamental lake with its family of swans, and finally, the walled garden that had been her favorite retreat during those long-ago summers. The wrought-iron gate yielded to her touch with a familiar creak, revealing the botanical treasure trove within. While the formal gardens were designed for beauty, this space had been created for botanical study, with specimens organized by family and region of origin rather than aesthetic appeal. Eliza moved slowly along the neat paths, recognizing old friends and discovering new additions, her fingers occasionally reaching out to touch a particularly interesting leaf or blossom. She was kneeling beside a small plant with unusual variegated foliage, examining its structure with such absorption that she failed to notice the tall figure who had entered the garden behind her. "Miss Thornfield," the Duke said, his deep voice startling her from her contemplation. "You rise early." Eliza rose quickly, brushing soil from her gloves as she turned to face him. "Your Grace, I hope I have not trespassed. I remembered this garden from childhood and wished to see if it remained as I recalled." Alexander approached, his expression softening as he glanced at the plant she had been examining. "Cypripedium calceolus," he identified. "The lady's slipper orchid, extremely rare in England now. This specimen was rescued from a woodland being cleared for farmland about 5 years ago. I am impressed by your success in transplanting it," Eliza replied, professional interest momentarily overcoming her awareness of his proximity. They are notoriously difficult to establish in cultivation, requiring specific soil fungi to thrive. "You are familiar with its requirements," the Duke observed, studying her with that same intensity she had noted at dinner. Eliza nodded, her enthusiasm for the subject overcoming her usual reserve. "My father permitted me to establish a small garden for native orchids at Thornfield. Before we had to sell the estate, I had collected 7 species, including a magnificent specimen of Orchis purpurea that took 3 years to flower." Alexander smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his austere features and reminded Eliza powerfully of the boy she had once known. "You're the only person who has noticed that specimen in years," he said, gesturing to the modest plant. "Most visitors are too busy admiring the roses to see the true treasures." The garden fell silent save for the gentle buzzing of bees and the distant call of a thrush. Eliza was acutely aware of the Duke standing beside her, close enough that she could detect the faint scent of sandalwood that clung to his clothing. The morning sunlight caught in his dark hair, revealing threads of auburn that were invisible in less direct illumination. "Do you remember the botanical collections we made, Your Grace?" she asked softly. "The summer we competed to find the most unusual specimens in the woodland beyond the lake? I kept the pressed examples for many years." "I remember everything about those summers, Miss Thornfield," he replied, his voice equally quiet. "In fact, I still have my collection, properly mounted and labeled in your precise handwriting. You were most insistent about the importance of scientific nomenclature." Eliza laughed, a sound of genuine delight that brought a corresponding warmth to the Duke's eyes. "I was rather pedantic as a child, I fear." Alexander shook his head, his expression serious, despite the smile that lingered at the corners of his mouth. "You were exactly as you should have been, passionate about your interests and unwilling to compromise their integrity. I found it refreshing then, as I do now." He offered his arm in a gesture both courtly and companionable. "Perhaps you would do me the honor of touring the rest of the gardens. I have made some additions since your last visit that might interest you, including a small alpine house for mountain specimens." As they walked together through the dew-dampened grounds, Eliza found herself relaxing into conversation that flowed as naturally as if the intervening years had never separated them. The Duke of Ravencroft, so cold and forbidding in society, showed no trace of that reserve as he described his botanical projects with genuine enthusiasm, his knowledge matching her own, and his observations demonstrating a depth of understanding she had rarely encountered. By the time they returned to the house for breakfast, Eliza had almost forgotten the disparity in their positions, responding to his questions and offering her own observations with an ease that felt both novel and strangely familiar, like returning to a beloved book long unread but instantly remembered upon opening. The tense conversation in Eliza's bedchamber crackled with Lady Montgomery's barely contained frustration as she paced before the window, her elaborate mourning cap bobbing with each emphatic gesture. Eliza sat at her dressing table, fingers working methodically at her embroidery while her aunt unleashed the lecture that had clearly been building since breakfast, when Alexander had once again engaged Eliza in conversation to the exclusion of the more eligible young ladies present. "I simply cannot understand what you think you are doing, Eliza," Lady Montgomery declared, pausing to fix her niece with an accusing stare. 3 days at Blackwood Manor, and you have monopolized the Duke's attention at every opportunity. It is most improper and entirely unfair to Rebecca." Eliza set down her needlework with deliberate calm. "I have done nothing to seek His Grace's attention, Aunt. We share certain intellectual interests, nothing more." Lady Montgomery made a sound of exasperation, her rings flashing as she waved one hand dismissively. "Intellectual interests, indeed. Do you imagine a man of the Duke's position seeks a blue-stocking wife who will bore his distinguished guests with discussions of plant specimens and obscure poetry? He requires a beautiful, accomplished young woman who will grace his home and provide him with heirs, not a plain spinster nearly on the shelf." The words stung despite Eliza's determination not to show it. At 26, she was well aware that society considered her matrimonial prospects all but exhausted. Still, the reminder of her perceived deficiencies from her own family member struck a particularly tender spot. "Rebecca is the beauty of the family," Lady Montgomery continued, her voice softening slightly as she sat beside her niece. "She has been trained for precisely such a match. Your insistence on engaging the Duke in these conversations diverts his attention from where it should naturally fall. I beg you to consider your sister's future and remove yourself from his path." Eliza looked down at her hands, practical hands with a few calluses from gardening rather than the unblemished softness prized in young ladies of quality. "What would you have me do, Aunt?" she asked quietly. "Pretend ignorance when he speaks to me? Feign disinterest in subjects that genuinely engage us both?" Lady Montgomery patted her arm in a gesture meant to be conciliatory. "Simply make yourself less available, my dear. Claim a headache when he suggests a walk. Remain with the older ladies during social hours. Allow Rebecca the opportunity to display her considerable charms without competition." With a rustle of silk, she rose and moved toward the door. "I am thinking only of what is best for all concerned." A man in the Duke's position cannot marry where he pleases without consideration of society's expectations. Remember that, Eliza, and spare yourself inevitable disappointment. Left alone, Eliza crossed to the window, gazing out at the gardens where she and Alexander had walked that morning, discussing the relative merits of different propagation methods for difficult alpine species. Her aunt's words echoed uncomfortably in her mind, reinforcing doubts that had already begun to surface. Whatever connection she felt with Alexander, society would deem it entirely inappropriate for the Duke of Ravencroft to ally himself with a penniless spinster when beautiful heiresses awaited his choice. Later that afternoon, seeking solitude to collect her thoughts, Eliza made her way to the library. She had nearly reached the heavy oak door when voices from the adjacent sitting room caught her attention, the distinctive tones of Lady Pembroke and Miss Harrington carrying clearly through the partially open door. "It is the most absurd thing I have ever witnessed," Lady Pembroke was saying with barely suppressed amusement. The Duke of Ravencroft, who could have his pick of the finest young ladies in England, spending hours discussing flowers with a spinster. Miss Harrington laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Perhaps he finds her lack of beauty restful. One cannot be constantly dazzled after all. "Poor Miss Thornfield," Lady Pembroke replied, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "At her age, she should know better than to set her sights on a duke. The desperation of these aging, unmarried women is truly pitiable." Eliza stepped back, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She turned quickly, seeking escape, only to collide with a solid figure behind her. Alexander's hand steadied her, his touch firm but gentle on her upper arms. His expression as he looked down at her was difficult to interpret, a mixture of concern and something darker, almost angry. From his position, he must have heard every word of the cruel exchange. "Miss Thornfield," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I was coming to ask if you would join me in examining some botanical texts I recently acquired, but perhaps you would prefer the garden. The air seems rather stifling indoors at present." The quiet understanding in his tone nearly undid her composure. She managed a nod, unable to trust her voice, and allowed him to guide her toward a side door that led directly to the terrace. As they emerged into the fresh air, Eliza took a steadying breath, acutely aware of Alexander's hand still resting lightly at her elbow and the silent support it offered. But beneath that momentary comfort, her aunt's warning echoed persistently. A man in the Duke's position cannot marry where he pleases. The truth of those words, reinforced by the cruel observations she had overheard, settled around Eliza's heart like an iron band, restricting hope, even as Alexander's continuing attention sought to nurture it. The evening entertainments at Blackwood Manor followed the predictable pattern of country house gatherings across England. Dinner gave way to music in the drawing room, with each accomplished young lady taking her turn at the pianoforte, while the Duke listened with polite attention. When card tables were arranged for whist, Eliza found herself partnered with an elderly gentleman who dozed between hands, making concentration on the game nearly impossible. After losing 3 consecutive rounds due to her partner's inattention, Eliza discreetly excused herself, claiming a desire for a book to read before retiring. No one remarked on her departure. All attention focused on Rebecca, who was performing a sentimental ballad to appreciative applause. The grand corridor stretched before her, dimly lit by wall sconces placed at intervals that left pools of shadow between islands of golden light. Eliza wandered without particular destination until an open door revealed the warm glow of a well-lit chamber beyond. She stepped inside and caught her breath at the sight of what must be the finest private library in Hampshire. 2 stories of bookshelves lined the walls, accessible by a wrought-iron spiral staircase that curved gracefully to the gallery above. Leather-bound volumes in rich shades of burgundy, forest green, and deep blue filled the shelves, their gilt lettering catching the light from the fire that burned cheerfully in the massive stone fireplace. The room smelled of beeswax, leather, and the particular fragrance of well-kept books, a scent Eliza had always associated with comfort and discovery. Drawn to the shelves like a moth to flame, she moved along the rows, fingers trailing lightly over the spines as she read titles and authors. An entire section devoted to natural sciences caught her attention, and within it, a collection of botanical works so comprehensive it rivaled the Royal Society's library. She selected a volume on alpine flora, its leather binding supple beneath her fingers, and carried it to a reading table, positioned to catch the best light from both windows and fireplace. As she opened the cover, something fluttered from between the pages, a delicate pressed flower, its blue petals faded but still recognizable as Gentiana verna, the spring gentian. Eliza stared at it in wonder, memories suddenly vivid. She had found this specimen on a hillside during their last summer together, Alexander holding her hand to steady her as she reached precariously for the tiny blossom growing from a crevice in the rocks. How strange that it should fall from this particular volume, preserved for 15 years like the memory it evoked. "I see you found my botanical sanctuary." Alexander's voice from the doorway startled her from her reverie. He entered, closing the door quietly behind him and crossing to where she stood, the pressed flower still resting on the open page before her. "I discovered it quite by accident," Eliza admitted, gesturing to the flower. "And this as well? You kept this all these years?" Alexander moved closer, his expression softening as he looked down at the delicate specimen. "Some memories are worth preserving, Miss Thornfield," he replied, his voice carrying a warmth that sent a tremor through her body. "Do you recall the day we found it?" "The hillside above the stream," Eliza said, the memory clear and precious. "You said it was the exact color of the summer sky, and I insisted it was closer to the shade of cornflowers in the meadow. We argued about it all the way home." Alexander laughed, the sound rich and genuine, transforming his features from their habitual seriousness into something that made Eliza's heart beat faster. "You were most determined to prove your point. I believe you even made me hold a cornflower against the flower for comparison. Those were extraordinary summers," he continued, his tone becoming reflective. "In many ways they shaped the man I became." Eliza looked up at him, surprised by the admission. "I am glad they were meaningful to you, Your Grace. For me as well, those summers were a time of perfect happiness before she trailed off, unwilling to speak of the financial troubles that had followed, forcing her family to withdraw from society. Before life intervened, Alexander finished for her, understanding evident in his expression. "We have both faced challenges since those days, I think." He gestured to the shelves surrounding them. "I built this collection over many years, guided in part by the enthusiasms we shared as children. Your interests helped shape my own, Miss Thornfield." The revelation left Eliza momentarily speechless. That her childhood companion had carried their shared passion through to adulthood, had constructed this temple to knowledge with her influence, however distant, was almost too much to comprehend. "I am honored to have played even a small role in the creation of such a magnificent library," she said finally. Alexander moved to the fireplace, his tall figure outlined by the dancing flames. "Not a small role, Eliza," he said softly, using her given name for the first time since their reunion. He turned to face her, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. "When my father sent me away to school, your letters were my greatest comfort. When they stopped coming, I felt the loss keenly. My father had discovered our correspondence," Eliza explained, the old pain resurfacing. "He forbade me to continue it, saying it was inappropriate to distract the heir to a dukedom with trifling observations about plants and poetry." Alexander nodded, his expression darkening briefly. "My father expressed similar sentiments from his end. He had very specific ideas about suitable connections for his heir." He crossed back to where she stood, close enough now that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, evidence of the years that had passed since they last stood thus in conversation. "But we are no longer children subject to our father's dictates," he said quietly. "And I find myself exceedingly grateful that circumstances have brought you back to Blackwood, even if temporarily." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings and shared memories. Then a clock chimed somewhere in the depths of the house, breaking the spell. Alexander stepped back, his expression composing itself once more into its customary reserve, though his eyes remained warm as they rested on her face. "It grows late," he said. "May I escort you back to the drawing room, or would you prefer to borrow the book for evening reading?" "I should like to borrow it if you don't mind," Eliza replied, carefully replacing the pressed flower between the pages where it had rested for so many years. As she followed Alexander from the library, Eliza cradled the book against her chest like a talisman, her mind reeling with the implications of their conversation and the evidence of feeling it suggested. Whatever Lady Montgomery and society might believe about the impossibility of connection between them, the preserved flower and Alexander's words told a different story, one that made hope flutter dangerously in her heart, despite all caution. The week at Blackwood Manor passed in a pleasant rhythm of morning walks, afternoon activities, and evening entertainments. For Eliza, each day brought new discoveries, both of the estate and, more intriguingly, of the man who owned it. Despite Lady Montgomery's continued attempts to promote Rebecca's interests, Alexander sought Eliza's company with flattering consistency, though always with proper decorum. On the 5th day of their visit, a rainstorm confined the party to indoor pursuits. While most gathered in the drawing room for music and conversation, Eliza excused herself to return a botanical volume to the library. The vastness of Blackwood Manor, with its numerous corridors and identical doors, proved treacherous to navigate alone. After several wrong turns, Eliza found herself in an unfamiliar wing, the portraits on the walls offering no guidance, as stern ancestral faces gazed down at her with identical expressions of aristocratic disdain. Hearing footsteps approaching and unwilling to be discovered wandering like a lost child, she quickly opened the nearest door and slipped inside. The room appeared to be a study of some sort, handsomely appointed with leather furniture and dominated by a massive desk positioned before tall windows that overlooked the south gardens. Rain streaked the glass, creating wavering patterns that matched Eliza's discomfiture at having entered the Duke's private domain uninvited. She had just decided to slip back into the corridor and continue her search for the library when voices approached from outside. With no time to escape, Eliza did the only thing possible. She concealed herself behind the heavy velvet curtains that flanked the windows, pressing her back against the cold glass and hoping that whoever entered would depart quickly. The door opened, and Alexander's distinctive voice reached her ears, followed by the deeper tones of several gentlemen. Their footsteps crossed to the desk area, and the sound of chairs being drawn back suggested they were settling for a discussion. "I appreciate your making time for us today, Ravencroft, particularly in such inclement weather," said one voice, cultured and authoritative. "Lord Wexley," Alexander replied with cool courtesy. "You mentioned a matter of some importance in your note. Since you gentlemen have travelled so far, shall we proceed directly to the purpose of your visit?" There was a brief silence, then a different voice, slightly hesitant. "We represent certain interests, Your Grace. Families of distinction who seek advantageous connections. Our daughters have been presented at court, possess significant dowries, and have been educated in all the accomplishments society values." There was a pause, and Eliza could almost see Alexander's raised eyebrow, the expression of polite inquiry he adopted when his patience was being tested. "Are you proposing a cattle auction, gentlemen, or merely a marriage mart?" A third voice, sharp with offence. "We are offering the most eligible matches in England, Your Grace. Lady Anne Rutherford, accomplished, beautiful, with £30,000. The Honourable Miss Cartwright, connected to the royal family through her mother's line. And my own daughter, Lady Sophia Wexley, educated in Paris, fluent in 3 languages, with an annual income of £5,000 independent of her dowry." A significant rustling of papers suggested documents being presented, likely settlements and financial details. From her hiding place, Eliza felt a curious hollowness spreading through her chest. Of course, such negotiations would be underway. A duke must marry, and marry well. Her aunt had been correct all along. Behind the velvet curtain, she closed her eyes, wishing she could block the sound as easily as the sight. Alexander remained silent so long that one of the gentlemen eventually prompted, "Your Grace? Have you no response to these generous offers?" When the Duke finally spoke, his voice had a quality Eliza had not heard before, a steely resolve beneath the customary control. "Gentlemen, I appreciate the compliment implied by your interest in allying your families with mine. However, I must decline all 3 proposals, regardless of their financial merits or the undoubted qualities of the ladies in question. One of the men spluttered in evident shock. "Decline? Without consideration? May we ask why, Your Grace?" There was the sound of a chair being pushed back, footsteps crossing to the window so near that Eliza held her breath, certain she would be discovered. When Alexander spoke again, he was so close that she could have reached out to touch him through the curtain. "I cannot marry where my heart does not reside," he said simply. "There is only one woman I have ever considered as my duchess, and her worth cannot be measured in pounds or connections." The room fell silent save for the persistent drumming of rain against the windows. Then Lord Wexley spoke again, his tone considerably cooler than before. "I see. We had heard rumours, of course, but did not credit them. You refer to the Thornfield girl, I presume. The spinster with the interest in plants." Eliza's heart seemed to stop entirely, then resume at double its normal pace. Another man laughed shortly. "Come now, Ravencroft. The girl is nearly on the shelf, without fortune or extraordinary beauty. Surely a momentary infatuation isn't worth sacrificing such advantageous connections." "My feelings for Miss Thornfield are neither momentary nor a matter for public discussion," Alexander replied, his voice carrying a warning that even Eliza, hidden and breathless, could recognize. "Now, gentlemen, I believe our business is concluded." The sound of chairs scraping back and papers being collected preceded footsteps moving toward the door. Just before it opened, Lord Wexley offered a parting observation. "Society has expectations of men in your position, Ravencroft. To disregard them entirely for sentimental reasons is both foolish and potentially damaging to your family's legacy." When the door closed behind the departing visitors, Eliza remained frozen in place, afraid to move, afraid even to breathe. After a moment, she heard Alexander sigh heavily, followed by the sound of a cabinet being opened and the clink of glass against glass. Then his footsteps crossed back to the desk, and silence fell again, broken only by the rain and the occasional rustle of papers. Eliza's mind raced with the implications of what she had overheard. "There is only one woman I have ever considered as my duchess." Could he truly mean her? The possibility seemed too extraordinary to credit, yet his defense of her to those powerful men had been unmistakable. She needed to escape, to find solitude to make sense of these revelations. With utmost care, she peered through a tiny gap in the curtains. Alexander sat at his desk, his back to her, apparently absorbed in documents. Moving with exquisite caution, Eliza eased from her hiding place and crept toward the door, her slippers silent on the thick carpet. She had nearly reached it when a floorboard creaked beneath her weight. Her heart seemed to stop as Alexander turned, his expression changing from surprise to something unreadable as he recognized her. "Miss Thornfield," he said quietly. "How long have you been there?" Eliza fled through the corridors of Blackwood Manor, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it must echo from the walls. She had no clear recollection of responding to Alexander's question or of making her escape from the study, only a blur of stammered excuses about being lost and seeking the library. She found refuge finally in a small sitting room, mercifully empty, where she sank onto a window seat, pressing her feverish forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the gentle rain had intensified into a proper storm, lightning occasionally illuminating the gardens in brief, ghostly tableaux before plunging them back into grey obscurity. Thunder rolled across the grounds, nature providing a dramatic accompaniment to the tumult in her own breast. "There is only one woman I have ever considered as my duchess." The words replayed themselves endlessly in her mind, tantalizing in their implication yet impossible to fully credit. Who was this woman who held such power over the Duke's heart? Lady Montgomery had mentioned no attachment in her extensive research before accepting the invitation, and certainly none of the staff or neighbors had alluded to any significant woman in his life. Could he truly have meant her, Eliza Thornfield, the penniless spinster whom society had already consigned to insignificance? It seemed incredible, yet his defense of her to those powerful men had been unmistakable. "My feelings for Miss Thornfield are neither momentary nor a matter for public discussion." A fresh bolt of lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that rattled the window panes. Eliza wrapped her arms around herself, overwhelmed by emotions she had long suppressed. Since her father's death and the family's subsequent financial collapse, she had trained herself to expect nothing, to find contentment in small pleasures and intellectual pursuits, rather than the dreams of love and family that occupied other women her age. Yet here, in the space of a week, Alexander had systematically dismantled those careful defenses, awakening feelings she had thought safely buried. I cannot marry where my heart does not reside. Was it possible that the boy who had shared her passion for botany had grown into a man who could love her despite society's expectations? Or was she constructing castles from clouds, misinterpreting kindness and shared interests as something deeper? The door opened, startling Eliza from her reverie. Rebecca entered, looking particularly lovely in a gown of pale yellow that complemented her golden curls. She crossed to join her sister at the window seat, her expression concerned. "I've been searching everywhere for you, Eliza. Aunt is asking questions about your absence from the drawing room." Eliza managed a faint smile, aware that her cheeks were still flushed and her manner distracted. "I lost my way returning from the library. This house is a veritable labyrinth." Rebecca studied her sister's face with uncharacteristic shrewdness. "It isn't just the house that has you looking so bewildered, is it? It's the Duke." Eliza looked down at her hands, unable to deny the truth yet unwilling to voice hopes that might prove groundless. "We were childhood friends, nothing more. His attention now is merely courtesy." Another lightning bolt illuminated the room, briefly transforming Rebecca's pretty features into a stark white mask before the following darkness softened them again. "The Duke of Ravencroft does not devote hours of his day to botanical discussions out of mere courtesy, Eliza," she said gently. "I may be young, but I recognize a man's interest when I see it, and I see how you look at him when you think no one is watching." Eliza felt tears gathering, whether from the unexpected understanding in her sister's voice or from the overwhelming events of the afternoon. She could not say. "What am I to do, Rebecca? I am 26, without fortune or extraordinary beauty, as Lord Wexley so bluntly observed this afternoon. Even if the Duke harbours some regard for me, society would deem such a match completely unsuitable." The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows in sheets driven by the rising wind. Rebecca took her sister's cold hands between her warm ones. "Do you love him?" she asked simply. The question hung in the air between them, demanding honesty that Eliza had scarcely admitted to herself. After a long moment, she nodded, a barely perceptible movement. "Since we were children, I think, though I didn't recognize it then. But what does that matter? Dukes do not marry for love, especially not to women like me." Rebecca squeezed her hands. "Perhaps this Duke is different. He has certainly behaved differently since our arrival, showing marked preference for your company over that of more conventional candidates. You must speak with him, Eliza. You must know his mind before we depart next week." Thunder crashed again, directly overhead, as if punctuating Rebecca's statement with nature's exclamation point. Eliza shook her head, fear clenching around her heart at the thought of such vulnerability. "I cannot. The risk of humiliation, of misunderstanding his intentions, is too great." Rebecca rose, smoothing her skirts with practiced grace. "Then you risk losing something precious, sister. Sometimes courage is required to secure happiness. Think on it." With that she departed, leaving Eliza alone once more with the storm beyond the window and the equally turbulent emotions within her breast. She pressed her fingertips to her temples, trying to make sense of the day's revelations. There is only one woman I have ever considered as my Duchess. If that woman truly was herself, did she have the courage to reach for such unexpected happiness? And if she had misinterpreted, could she bear the devastation that would follow? The storm continued unabated, nature mirroring the conflict in her heart as evening shadows gathered in the corners of the room and the first candles were lit in the corridors beyond. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, the rain-washed landscape gleaming with renewed vibrancy beneath a cloudless sky. Blackwood Manor had suffered some minor damage during the night, a fallen branch against the conservatory roof and several uprooted flowers in the formal gardens, necessitating inspection tours of both house and grounds. Lady Montgomery had promptly volunteered Rebecca to accompany the Duke on these rounds, but Alexander had politely declined, explaining that estate matters required his personal attention. By mid-afternoon, the household had settled into quiet pursuits. Eliza sat in the drawing room with her embroidery, listening to Rebecca practice a new sonata on the pianoforte, while steadfastly avoiding thoughts of her encounter with Alexander the previous day. She had successfully evaded any private conversation with him thus far, pleading a headache at breakfast and joining a group of ladies for needlework immediately afterward. Her concentration was interrupted when the Duke himself appeared in the doorway, his tall figure commanding immediate attention from everyone present. "Ladies," he said with a formal bow, "I thought perhaps you might enjoy a tour of the portrait gallery this afternoon. The recent cleaning has restored several ancestral paintings to their former glory." The suggestion met with general approval, and soon the entire party was following Alexander up the grand staircase to the west wing, where generations of Ravencrofts gazed down from ornate gilt frames. The Duke proved a knowledgeable guide, relating historical anecdotes about various ancestors with dry wit that transformed what might have been a tedious exercise into an entertaining diversion. Eliza hung back from the main group, allowing Lady Montgomery and Rebecca to maintain positions closest to their host while she examined the paintings at her own pace. She had nearly reached the end of the gallery when she realized Alexander had materialized at her side, the rest of the party now several portraits ahead. "Miss Thornfield," he said quietly, "there is something I wish to show you, if you would permit me." His expression held an intensity that made refusal impossible. Eliza glanced toward the others, but they were thoroughly engaged in Lady Montgomery's dramatic retelling of her own family's historical connections to the Ravencrofts. "This way," Alexander murmured, guiding her toward what appeared to be a solid panel at the end of the gallery. His fingers pressed a concealed mechanism, revealing a narrow door that opened silently into a circular chamber beyond. Hesitantly, Eliza stepped through, finding herself in what was clearly an artist's studio, illuminated by skylight windows that flooded the space with clear northern light. Easels stood at various stations, some holding blank canvases, others works in progress, but it was a single portrait positioned prominently in the center of the room that drew her attention and held it in stunned silence. From the canvas, her own face gazed back at her, rendered with extraordinary sensitivity and skill. The artist had captured not merely her physical features, the chestnut hair and thoughtful hazel eyes, but something more elusive, an essence of character that few had ever troubled to perceive. It was herself, as she had never seen herself, beautiful not in the conventional manner of Rebecca or the Harrington sisters, but with a luminous intelligence and quiet dignity that transformed her ordinary features into something remarkable. Alexander stood beside her, watching her reaction with evident apprehension. "I began it after your last letter arrived," he said softly. "When correspondence between us was forbidden, I found I could not bear to lose your image as well as your words. Over the years I added to it from memory, trying to imagine how you might have changed as you grew older." Eliza tore her gaze from the portrait to stare at him in wonderment. "You painted this," she whispered. "From memory." Alexander nodded, a faint flush coloring his cheekbones. "I took up painting at school as a way to preserve the botanical specimens we collected. Later it became a refuge from the expectations that increasingly closed around me. This room has been my sanctuary since inheriting the title, the one place where I can be simply Alexander rather than the Duke of Ravencroft." Eliza moved closer to the painting, noting the exquisite attention to detail, the delicate rendering of expression that suggested the subject was just about to speak on some matter of importance. "You captured my very essence," she said softly. "How is that possible when we have been separated for 15 years? Alexander stepped beside her, his gaze moving between the portrait and her living face. "I've carried your image in my mind since we were children," he admitted, his voice low and intense. "You were my dearest friend, the only person who saw me, not my title. When my father severed our connection, it was like losing a vital part of myself." His hand lifted as if to touch her face, then dropped back to his side. "I never forgot you, Eliza, not for a single day." The confession hung in the air between them, fraught with meaning and unspoken emotion. Eliza felt her heart beating wildly, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling in the face of such extraordinary evidence of his regard. If what he said was true, if this portrait represented years of memory and longing, then perhaps the woman he had spoken of to the aristocrats was indeed herself. Yet still caution held her silent, the habits of disappointment too deeply ingrained to be easily abandoned. "Why did you invite us to Blackwood?" she asked finally, needing absolute clarity before surrendering to hope. "After all these years, why now?" Alexander moved to the window, sunlight etching his profile against the glass. "When my father died 5 years ago, I gained access to his private correspondence. Among his papers, I found letters from your father, including one that explained your family's financial difficulties and requested the loan that might have saved Thornfield Manor. My father refused, of course." His eyes, when he turned back to her, held regret and something deeper, more compelling. "I have spent these 5 years searching for you, Eliza. Society columns, mutual acquaintances, even hiring investigators. When I finally discovered you were living with Lady Montgomery in London, I arranged the invitation immediately." He crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, close enough to detect the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for hers. "I needed to know if the connection we shared as children still existed," he said simply. "I needed to see if the woman you had become matched the image I had carried in my heart all these years." And Eliza asked, scarcely daring to breathe as his fingers closed gently around hers. A smile transformed his features, reminiscent of the laughing boy she had once known, yet infinitely more compelling on the face of the man he had become. "And I discovered that reality far surpasses memory," Alexander replied, his voice deepening with emotion. "The intelligent child has become a remarkable woman, one who still sees beyond titles and fortune to the man beneath, one who still challenges my mind and touches my heart in ways no other ever has, one whom I have come to love with a depth that terrifies and exhilarates me in equal measure." The world seemed to narrow to this single moment, this circular room filled with golden light, this extraordinary confession that rewrote everything Eliza had believed about her place in the world and her value as a woman. It was too much to absorb at once, this revelation that the Duke of Ravencroft, the most eligible bachelor in England, had spent years searching for her, painting her from memory, preserving their childhood connection in his heart against all odds and expectations. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the full extent of her own feelings, the growing attraction that had burgeoned into something far deeper during their days together at Blackwood. "Alexander," she began, her voice catching with emotion, but the moment was shattered by the sound of the door opening behind them. Lady Montgomery stood framed in the doorway, her expression shifting rapidly from surprise to calculation as she took in the scene before her, the intimate proximity of her niece and the Duke, their clasped hands, and most significantly the portrait that dominated the room. "Your Grace," she said, her voice strained with forced lightness, "we wondered where you had disappeared to. I see you have been showing Eliza your artistic endeavors." The moment of perfect understanding between Eliza and Alexander fractured, reality with all its complications flooding back. Yet, as they followed Lady Montgomery back to the gallery where the others waited, Alexander maintained his hold on Eliza's hand until the last possible moment, his fingers squeezing gently in silent communication. Whatever obstacles might lie ahead, Eliza now carried one certainty in her heart, a precious knowledge that transformed everything. Alexander Ravencroft, Duke of Ravencroft, the most eligible bachelor in England, loved her, Eliza Thornfield, and had done so for 15 years. The revelation left her breathless with wonder and frightened by possibility in equal measure. The grand ball at Blackwood Manor had been the highlight of the local social calendar for generations, and Alexander had revived the tradition with meticulous attention to detail. The ballroom, seldom used since his father's time, had been transformed by countless candles, fresh flowers, and the musical strains of a full orchestra brought from London for the occasion. Crystal chandeliers cast their golden glow over the assembled company, catching the flash of jewels at elegant throats and the shimmer of silk gowns as couples moved through the intricate patterns of a country dance. Eliza stood at the edge of the room, watching the swirl of color and movement with a sense of detachment. The days since the revelation in the portrait gallery had passed in a curious limbo. Lady Montgomery's constant presence had prevented any private conversation between Eliza and Alexander, though his gaze sought hers often, communicating silently across crowded rooms. Tonight, she wore her finest gown, a creation of deep burgundy silk that had belonged to her mother and had been hastily refashioned by Rebecca and their maid. The color brought warmth to her complexion, and she had arranged her chestnut hair in a more elaborate style than usual, with pearl pins borrowed from her sister securing the arrangement. She knew she would never possess the conventional beauty that drew admiring glances to Rebecca, resplendent tonight in pale blue that matched her eyes. But for once, Eliza felt almost confident in her appearance. The dancing had begun with Alexander partnering Lady Montgomery, as protocol dictated, followed by Rebecca. When the third set ended, he made his way purposefully toward where Eliza stood, his expression warming as he approached. "Miss Thornfield, would you honor me with the next dance?" he asked, extending his hand with formal courtesy belied by the warmth in his eyes. Eliza curtsied, placing her gloved hand in his. "It would be my pleasure, Your Grace." The orchestra struck up the opening notes of a waltz as Alexander led her onto the floor. His hand at her waist was firm yet respectful as they began to move in perfect unison, as if they had danced together 1,000 times before. "I have waited all evening for this," he murmured, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "You look beautiful, Eliza. The burgundy suits you perfectly." Eliza felt color rise to her cheeks at the compliment. "Thank you. I fear it pales in comparison to the splendor around us." Her gaze swept the ballroom, noting the elaborate gowns and magnificent jewels adorning the other ladies. Alexander guided her through a graceful turn. "You outshine them all," he replied simply. His sincerity warmed her more than any elaborate flattery could have done. They moved together in harmonious silence for several moments, each acutely aware of the watching eyes that followed their progress around the floor. "I have been thinking about what you showed me in the studio," Eliza said finally. "The portrait. It is extraordinary, Alexander." "My small talent hardly does justice to the subject," he replied, his gaze intensifying. "There is so much I wish to say to you, Eliza, but this is hardly the venue for such conversation. When the dancing ends, perhaps you might step onto the terrace for some fresh air. I could join you there in a few minutes." Before Eliza could respond, the music drew to a close. Alexander escorted her from the floor, his hand lingering briefly over hers before he was claimed by Lady Harrington for the next dance. Eliza made her way toward the refreshment room, intent on securing a cool drink before following Alexander's suggestion to seek the terrace. She had nearly reached her destination when Lady Pembroke's voice cut through the general conversation nearby. "It's really quite pathetic," the older woman was saying to a circle of rapt listeners, her voice pitched to carry just far enough. A woman her age, setting her cap at a duke. One can almost smell the desperation. Eliza froze, aware that several heads had turned in her direction, expressions ranging from embarrassed discomfort to poorly concealed amusement. A gentleman Eliza didn't recognize spoke in response, his tone mockingly concerned. "Come now, Lady Pembroke. Miss Thornfield is hardly ancient, merely well past her prime, and remarkably persistent despite it." The lady simpered behind her fan. "When one has failed to secure any husband for over 8 seasons, I suppose even the most inappropriate target becomes tempting, particularly when financial circumstances are as strained as the Thornfields are rumored to be." The implication was unmistakable, that Eliza was attempting to trap Alexander for his fortune, using feminine wiles to compensate for her lack of youth and beauty. The assembled listeners tittered nervously, several glancing in Eliza's direction to gauge her reaction. She stood rigid with humiliation, her face burning and her throat tight with unshed tears. "I believe you misspeak, Lady Pembroke." Alexander's voice cut through the moment like a blade, cold with controlled fury. All conversation in the vicinity ceased as the Duke of Ravencroft stepped into the circle, his expression thunderous. "To imply that Miss Thornfield has set her cap for anyone, let alone myself, is both incorrect and unconscionably rude. His gaze swept the gathered company, who seemed collectively to shrink beneath his displeasure. "I hold Miss Thornfield in the highest esteem for her intelligence, dignity, and character, qualities that appear in notably short supply among certain members of our present company." Lady Pembroke had gone quite pale, her fan working furiously. "Your Grace, I meant no offence. Merely observed that the lady's attention to you has been rather marked, and at her age," Alexander cut her off, his voice sharp with disdain. "Her age is entirely irrelevant, madam, as is your opinion on the matter. I suggest you direct your considerable talent for observation elsewhere before I am forced to reconsider your welcome at Blackwood." The public rebuke, delivered by their host and the highest-ranking peer in the county, created an immediate sensation. Whispers spread through the ballroom like fire through dry grass, heads turning to witness Lady Pembroke's mortification and the Duke's evident anger. Eliza, the unwilling centre of attention, felt the weight of 100 curious stares. The defence, while gallant, had only confirmed what many had already suspected, that the Duke of Ravencroft had developed a tender for the spinster, Miss Thornfield. And while his rank permitted him such eccentricity, she would forever be marked as the aging, plain woman who had somehow enchanted a duke, an object of jealousy and speculation rather than genuine respect. The pressure of so many eyes, the whispers barely concealed behind fans and gloved hands, the mixture of pity and resentment directed her way became suddenly, overwhelmingly unbearable. With a murmured excuse to no one in particular, Eliza turned and fled the ballroom, seeking escape from the suffocating weight of society's judgment. The terrace doors stood open to the mild spring night, and she slipped through them gratefully, gulping the cool air like a drowning woman suddenly granted breath. Tears blurred her vision as she hurried down the stone steps and into the formal gardens, where lanterns had been hung in the trees to create a fairy tale atmosphere for guests wishing to stroll between dances. Eliza sought darker paths, away from potential observers, until she reached a small stone bench beside a reflecting pool, hidden from the house by a screen of ornamental shrubs. There, finally alone, she allowed the tears to fall, silent testimony to the pain inflicted by Lady Pembroke's cruel words and, more significantly, by the realization that such cruelty would be her constant companion should she ever become Alexander's Duchess. She had known, of course, that society would deem such a match unsuitable, but the reality of facing such censure, the public humiliation of being dismissed as desperate and past her prime, was far more devastating than she had anticipated. How could she subject Alexander to such disapproval? How could she bear it herself? The night air carried the distant strains of music from the ballroom, a poignant reminder of the world from which she had fled. A world where her presence at Alexander's side would always be met with raised eyebrows and whispered commentary, forever the unsuitable choice, the woman not quite good enough for the Duke of Ravencroft. The night air had grown cooler as Eliza sat by the reflecting pool, her tears gradually subsiding into a dull ache of resignation. The garden around her was still except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant strains of music drifting from the ballroom. Moonlight silvered the surface of the pool, transforming the formal plantings into mysterious shapes of varying darkness. She had spent perhaps a quarter-hour in this secluded spot, when the sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path alerted her to another's presence. She rose quickly, wiping away the last traces of tears and preparing to excuse herself should she encounter another guest seeking refuge from the heat of the ballroom. But it was Alexander who emerged from between the ornamental shrubs, his white evening attire gleaming in the moonlight as he moved purposefully toward her. "Eliza," he said softly, relief evident in his voice. "I have been searching the gardens for you." "Your Grace," she responded automatically, her emotions too raw for anything more personal. "I apologize for leaving so abruptly. I required some air." Alexander stepped closer, close enough that she could see the concern etching lines around his eyes. "Lady Pembroke has been removed from the ball," he informed her. His tone suggesting this outcome gave him considerable satisfaction. Her behavior was unconscionable. "What she said was merely what everyone thinks," Eliza replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. that I am a spinster past her prime, setting her cap at a duke out of desperation. She turned away, unwilling to see pity in his eyes. They are not entirely wrong, are they? I am 26, without fortune or extraordinary beauty. By society's standards, I am indeed past my prime. Alexander moved to stand beside her at the edge of the pool, his reflection joining hers on the moonlit surface. "Do you imagine I care one whit for society's standards?" he asked quietly. Eliza glanced up at him, struck by the intensity of his expression. "You may not care now, but in time, the constant whispers, the raised eyebrows, the speculation about why the Duke of Ravencroft chose such an unsuitable bride, it would wear on you, on us both." Alexander laughed softly, the sound holding no humor. "I have endured society's speculation and judgment since inheriting the title at 18. The Ton has opinions on everything from my investments to my choice of waistcoat. Why should my choice of wife be any different?" She studied his profile in the silvery light, the strong line of his jaw, the proud set of his shoulders. "Because marriage is forever," she said simply. "Because the woman who becomes your duchess should bring you advantage, not censure. You deserve someone worthy of your position." A muscle tightened in his jaw. "And who determines worthiness, Eliza? Society, with its shallow values and mercenary calculations? Or might I be permitted some say in the matter?" He turned to face her fully, reaching for her hands and holding them firmly between his own. "I have spent 15 years without you, and the void of your absence has been a constant ache. I have entertained the attentions of dozens of suitable young ladies, each more accomplished and beautiful than the last, each selected by society as an appropriate match for a duke. Not one has touched my heart or engaged my mind as you did when we were children, as you do now as a woman." Eliza's pulse quickened at his words, at the warmth of his hands around hers, at the unmistakable sincerity in his voice, yet still doubt lingered. "The 3 aristocrats who visited you," she said hesitantly. "You told them there was only one woman you had ever considered as your duchess. Was that truly me?" Even in the moonlight, she could see color rise in his cheeks, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You heard that conversation? I was lost in the house and entered your study seeking direction," she explained quickly. "When I heard voices approaching, I hid behind the curtains. I never meant to eavesdrop, but I couldn't leave without being discovered." Alexander shook his head, a rueful smile touching his lips. "So you know that I refused 3 eminently suitable matches and incurred the displeasure of some of the most powerful families in England." He released one of her hands to touch her cheek gently, his fingers cool against her skin. "It has only ever been you, Eliza, since we were children, since before I understood what love meant." The confession, spoken so simply in the moonlit garden, seemed to stop time itself. Eliza stood perfectly still, scarcely breathing as his words washed over her. Healing wounds she had not known were still raw. All the years of feeling invisible, of being dismissed as too plain, too intelligent, too unmarriageable, seemed to fade into insignificance in the face of this one man's unwavering regard. "But why did you never write, after your father's death?" she asked, needing to understand the years of silence between them. "Why wait 5 years to find me?" Alexander sighed, his expression darkening with regret. "My father left the dukedom in considerable disarray. There were debts, mismanaged properties, legal challenges to certain investments. I spent those first years putting our affairs in order, establishing myself as a competent steward of the title. I could not in good conscience seek you out until I had secured my position and could offer you the protection of a stable future. And then, when I finally had the freedom to search for you, you had vanished from society. Your father's death, your family's financial collapse, all of it had transpired without my knowledge." He drew her closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "When I finally discovered your whereabouts, I arranged this house party with one purpose only, to discover if the woman you had become still matched the girl I remembered, if the connection we once shared could be rekindled after so many years apart." Eliza gazed up at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "And what did you discover?" she asked softly. Alexander smiled, the full, unreserved smile that transformed his features and reminded her powerfully of the boy he had been. I discovered that my memory, treasured though it was, paled in comparison to reality. That the woman you have become exceeds every expectation and fulfills every hope. That despite the years and distance between us, my heart recognizes yours as if no time had passed at all. His hand still cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. I love you, Eliza Thornfield. I have loved you since we were children, collecting botanical specimens and arguing about proper classification. I will love you until my last breath, regardless of what society might think of the match. The words, spoken with such simple conviction, broke through the last of Eliza's defenses. Tears welled in her eyes again, but these were tears of a different nature entirely, born of joy rather than humiliation. I love you too, Alexander, she whispered. I think perhaps I always have, though I never dared to name the feeling. He drew her into his arms then, holding her against his heart as if she were precious beyond measure. The moonlight bathed them in silver. The distant music provided a gentle accompaniment, and the garden where they had played as children witnessed their first embrace as adults, a circle completed after 15 years of separation. In that perfect moment, society's expectations and judgments seemed distant and irrelevant, powerless against the strength of a connection that had survived years of absence and flowered anew with their reunion. Time seemed suspended in the moonlit garden as Eliza remained in Alexander's embrace, her head resting against his chest where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath layers of fine linen and wool. His confession of love, so unexpected yet so deeply longed for, had momentarily transported her beyond the constraints of society and circumstance to a place where only their feelings mattered. Yet as the distant music from the ballroom changed tempo, reality began to intrude once more. Inside those glittering rooms, the Tun was undoubtedly still dissecting Lady Pembroke's public humiliation and speculating about the Duke's precipitous departure in search of Miss Thornfield. The whispers would already have begun, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Reluctantly, Eliza stepped back from Alexander's embrace, though she allowed her hands to remain clasped in his. I cannot pretend your words do not fill my heart with joy, she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. To be loved by you, to hear that you have carried me in your thoughts all these years as I have carried you in mine, is more than I ever dared hope for. But Alexander, sensing the unspoken qualification in her tone, tightened his grip on her fingers. But what, Eliza? Surely you cannot doubt the sincerity of my feelings. No, she replied quickly. Never that, but I must question the wisdom of acting upon them. Alexander frowned, the moonlight casting his features in dramatic relief. Wisdom, he repeated, an interesting choice of words. Some might suggest that love transcends mere wisdom. Some might also suggest that a duke who married a penniless spinster of 26 had taken leave of his senses entirely, Eliza countered, unable to keep a trace of bitterness from her voice. You witnessed what happened tonight. Lady Pembroke's cruelty was merely a public expression of what society thinks privately. Alexander made a dismissive gesture. Lady Pembroke is a spiteful woman whose opinion matters less than nothing to me. Society will adjust to whatever choice I make. I am, after all, the Duke of Ravencroft. The title was spoken with ironic emphasis, reminding her of the enormous gulf in their social positions. It is precisely because you are the Duke of Ravencroft that we must consider this carefully, Eliza insisted, withdrawing her hands from his and clasping them tightly before her. Your position demands a suitable match, someone who will strengthen your connections and be accepted without question by your peers. Alexander stepped closer, moonlight catching in his dark hair as he shook his head in frustration. My position grants me the freedom to choose according to my heart rather than calculation. The Tun may gossip, but they will not dare to cut the Duchess of Ravencroft, whatever her origins. Eliza turned away, moving to the edge of the reflecting pool, where twin moons shimmered on the still surface. Would you subject someone you love to constant whispers, to thinly veiled insults disguised as compliments, to the knowledge that every invitation accepted or declined would be scrutinized for evidence of your mistake. Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. They would make your life miserable for choosing me. I cannot bear to be the cause of your unhappiness. In the silence that followed, only the distant music and the soft splash of water from a nearby fountain could be heard. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice held a new note, something between desperation and determination. So, you would refuse me, refuse us both the happiness we might find together because of what others might say. Is society's approval worth more than love, Eliza? She turned to face him again, her expression grave in the moonlight. Not worth more, but impossible to ignore. A duchess is a public figure, Alexander. Her every action reflects on her husband and his family. The whispers that follow me now would become a chorus if I accepted your proposal. And in time, those whispers would reach you as well. They would say you had been trapped, or bewitched, or had suffered some temporary madness. They would wait eagerly for the marriage to falter, for you to seek comfort elsewhere, as so many men in your position do when the initial infatuation fades. Alexander crossed to her in 2 quick strides, taking her shoulders in a gentle but firm grip. "Is that what you believe this is?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Some temporary infatuation that will fade?" Eliza reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I believe you love me now," she said softly, "and I love you with all my heart. But love alone cannot withstand the constant pressure of disapproval. It would change us both, in time." He captured her hand, pressing it more firmly against his cheek. "You underestimate my constancy, Eliza, and perhaps your own as well." She smiled sadly, tears gathering in her eyes despite her determination to remain composed. "Perhaps I do. But I cannot ignore what I witnessed tonight. Lady Pembroke spoke for many, and there are those of higher rank and greater influence who would express similar sentiments, if perhaps with more subtlety." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken arguments and fragile hopes. Alexander sighed, releasing her hand but maintaining his steady gaze. "I will not accept your refusal tonight," he said finally. "Not when it stems from fear rather than lack of feeling. Consider carefully what you would sacrifice, what we both would lose, for the sake of avoiding society's censure. Remember that happiness, true happiness, is far rarer than social approval." Eliza nodded, unable to trust her voice as tears threatened to spill over. Alexander bent to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, a gesture so tender it nearly undid her composure entirely. "Think on it, my love," he murmured. "I have waited 15 years to find you again. I can grant you time to reconcile your heart and your fears." The return to the ballroom was accomplished separately, Alexander preceding Eliza by several minutes to avoid fueling further gossip. As she re-entered the brightly lit space, moving quietly along the edge of the room to avoid notice, she caught sight of him across the crowd, his tall figure unmistakable as he conversed with an elderly gentleman. As if sensing her presence, he looked up, their gazes meeting across the sea of dancers. The love she saw in his eyes, unguarded and profound, brought fresh tears to her own. How could she deny them both the chance at happiness? Yet how could she subject him to the scandal that would surely follow such an unsuitable match? The question followed her through the remainder of the evening and into the small hours of the morning, where sleep proved elusive despite her emotional exhaustion. Dawn brought no respite from the emotional turmoil of the previous evening. The sky outside Eliza's window, a leaden grey that matched her spirits perfectly. She had slept little, her mind replaying Alexander's words and her own response in an endless cycle of hope and doubt. Rising earlier than usual, she dressed in a simple morning gown of dove grey, her movements mechanical as her maid arranged her hair in its customary style. The house seemed unusually quiet as she descended to the breakfast room, finding only Rebecca and an elderly cousin of the Duke already at the table. "Good morning, Eliza," Rebecca greeted her, concern evident in her blue eyes. "You look exhausted, sister. Did you not sleep well?" Eliza managed a wan smile as she accepted a cup of tea from a footman. "The excitement of the ball kept me awake," she replied non-committally, unwilling to discuss the true reason for her sleepless night in company. She glanced toward the head of the table, where Alexander's place remained conspicuously empty. "Is His Grace not joining us this morning?" The elderly cousin, a Colonel Ravencroft who had arrived for the ball the previous day, cleared his throat importantly. "The Duke was called to London before dawn on a matter of some urgency," he announced, buttering his toast with military precision. "A messenger arrived with dispatches requiring his immediate attention. Something about investments in the West Indies. He asked me to convey his apologies to his guests." Eliza's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down, her hand suddenly unsteady. "He has gone," she repeated, her voice sounding distant to her own ears, without a word. The colonel nodded, oblivious to her distress. Left instructions for his secretary to see to the comfort of his guests, of course. Very considerate, the Duke. Always has been, even as a boy. Might be gone a week or more, from what I gathered. Business can't wait, you know. Eliza sat in stunned silence as breakfast continued around her, the food on her plate untouched as conversation ebbed and flowed. Alexander had departed without speaking to her, without a private word of farewell or explanation after their emotional encounter in the garden. Had her rejection wounded him so deeply that he could not bear to see her again? Or had he simply recognized the truth in her concerns and decided to end their association cleanly, without prolonging the pain for either of them? Rebecca touched her arm gently. "Are you quite well, Eliza? You have gone quite pale." "I find myself with a slight headache," she replied, rising from the table. "If you'll excuse me, I think I shall rest in my room for a bit." The morning passed in a blur of conflicting emotions as Eliza sat by her window, gazing out at the increasingly dismal weather. Rain began to fall, softly at first, then with increasing intensity, sheets of water obscuring the view of the gardens where she and Alexander had walked so companionably and later shared their most intimate conversation. By mid-afternoon, a footman delivered a letter to her room, the Ravencroft seal imprinted in black wax on the expensive paper. Eliza broke it with trembling fingers, hope flaring briefly in her breast, only to be extinguished as she read the formal note inside. "The Duke of Ravencroft presents his compliments to Miss Thornfield and begs to be excused for his abrupt departure. Urgent business requires his presence in London for an indeterminate period. His secretary will see to the comfort of all guests at Blackwood Manor for as long as they wish to remain." No personal message, no reference to their conversation in the garden, no indication of his feelings beyond the most correct social pleasantries. Eliza pressed the paper to her chest, fighting back tears. She had feared exactly this outcome, that society's expectations would eventually override whatever genuine feeling existed between them. She had not expected it to happen quite so quickly or completely. By evening, Lady Montgomery had decided their party should return to London the following day. "There seems little point in remaining when our host is absent," she declared at dinner, where Alexander's empty chair at the head of the table seemed to emphasize the hollowness of the gathering. "Besides, the season will soon be upon us. We must prepare Rebecca for her presentation at court." The journey back to London the next morning matched Eliza's mood perfectly, rain lashing against the carriage windows as they rolled away from Blackwood Manor. She turned for one last glimpse of the house where, for a brief, magical moment, she had allowed herself to believe in the possibility of happiness. Now that dream was extinguished, replaced by the cold reality she had always known to be true, that women like herself did not become duchesses, and men like Alexander ultimately bowed to society's expectations. Their time at Blackwood Manor took on the quality of a beautiful but ephemeral dream, already fading at the edges as the distance between them increased with each turn of the carriage wheels. Rebecca reached across to take her sister's hand, her expression sympathetic, though she had not been told the details of what had transpired. Eliza managed a small smile of acknowledgement, grateful for the silent support, even as she wrestled with the knowledge that she had likely lost forever the one man who had truly seen and valued her. The carriage rolled on through the dreary landscape, carrying her back to London and the circumscribed existence she had known before Alexander had re-entered her life and awakened dreams she had long since abandoned. The Duke had come to his senses, as she had known he must. Whatever genuine feeling might have existed between them had proven insufficient against the weight of position and expectation. It was, she told herself firmly, for the best. Better this clean break than a lifetime of whispers and judgment, of watching the love in his eyes gradually give way to resentment as society punished them both for their unconventional match. Yet this rational understanding did nothing to ease the ache in her heart or stem the tears that mingled with the raindrops on the carriage window, invisible evidence of dreams reluctantly surrendered. 3 weeks had passed since the party at Blackwood Manor had returned to London, 3 weeks of grey spring skies and persistent rain that mirrored Eliza's melancholy perfectly. Lady Montgomery, satisfied that her elder niece had come to her senses regarding any attachment to the Duke, had thrown herself wholeheartedly into preparations for Rebecca's court presentation. The younger sister was being fitted for increasingly elaborate gowns, practicing the intricacies of the formal curtsy required before the Queen, and memorizing the complex social hierarchies that governed court society. Eliza had withdrawn from these preparations as much as politeness allowed, finding refuge in a project she had begun shortly after their return. Having discovered a small collection of pressed botanical specimens from her childhood, preserved in the pages of an old book of poetry, she had conceived the idea of creating an illustrated guide to native English orchids, combining scientific descriptions with practical advice on finding and preserving these rare plants. The work absorbed her attention during long hours alone, providing some distraction from thoughts of Alexander and the dreams his brief re-entry into her life had awakened. On this particular evening, 3 weeks to the day since their departure from Blackwood Manor, Eliza found herself attending a literary salon at the home of Mrs. Whitmore, a kindly widow whose interest in natural sciences made her gatherings among the few social events Eliza genuinely enjoyed. The small drawing room buzzed with animated conversation as various guests discussed recent publications, scientific discoveries, and cultural events. Eliza sat somewhat apart from the main group, engaged in conversation with an elderly gentleman who had published several respected works on British flora. "I find your approach to the subject most refreshing, Miss Thornfield," Professor Harlow was saying, his rheumy eyes brightening with genuine interest. "Most botanical texts focus exclusively on classification and ignore the practical aspects of cultivation. Your proposed guide would fill a significant gap in the literature." Eliza smiled, pleased by his endorsement. "Thank you, Professor. I fear publishers may find the subject too specialized, but I believe there are many amateur botanists who would appreciate guidance specific to our native orchids." The discussion might have continued in this vein, had not a sudden ripple of excitement passed through the room. Heads turned toward the entrance as a new arrival was announced, the conversation dropping to hushed whispers before resuming with increased animation. Miss Edith Davies, a frequent attendee of these gatherings, hurried to Eliza's side, her expression alight with gossip. "The Duke of Ravencroft has just arrived," she confided in a stage whisper. "His Grace has never attended Mrs. Whitmore's salon before. Indeed, he rarely appears at any literary or scientific gatherings." How extraordinary! Eliza's heart gave a painful lurch at the mention of Alexander's name. She glanced involuntarily toward the doorway where he stood conversing with their hostess, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. He appeared thinner than when she had last seen him, his formal evening attire emphasizing the lean strength of his frame. Even from across the room, she could sense a certain tension in his bearing, a subtle rigidity that had not been present during their time at Blackwood. "I had heard the Duke returned to town several days ago," Miss Davies continued, oblivious to Eliza's distress. "Lady Harrington told me he has refused all social invitations until now. There is talk that he may finally be considering marriage, though to whom remains a mystery. The Pembroke girl is widely considered the most likely candidate, despite that unfortunate scene at his ball." Eliza turned back to Professor Harlow, desperately seeking distraction from this painful speculation. The professor, showing more perception than Miss Davies, smoothly redirected their conversation to the specific growing conditions required by Cypripedium calceolus, allowing Eliza to regain her composure. From the corner of her eye, she observed Alexander moving through the room, stopping to exchange brief greetings but clearly making his way in her direction. Before he could reach her, however, Lady Montgomery appeared at Eliza's side, her expression a mixture of alarm and determination. "My dear," she said with barely concealed urgency, "I have just remembered an important engagement. We must depart immediately." The transparent attempt to prevent any interaction between Eliza and the Duke might have been amusing under different circumstances. Now it merely underscored the impossibility of their situation. Society would never countenance such a match, and Lady Montgomery, practical to her core, was determined to spare her niece further pain and potential scandal. Eliza rose obediently, making her apologies to Professor Harlow. As she followed her aunt toward the door, she allowed herself one final glance in Alexander's direction. He had stopped in mid-conversation, his attention entirely focused on her. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the crowded room, and the naked emotion she glimpsed in his gaze nearly undid her composure entirely. Then Lady Montgomery firmly guided her through the door, and the moment was lost. In the carriage returning home, her aunt broached the subject directly for the first time since their return from Blackwood Manor. "I trust you understand why we left, Eliza," she said, her tone gentler than usual. "The Duke may have shown you certain attentions in the country, but in London, his interest could only lead to gossip and potential embarrassment for us all. Such connections, once broken, are best left undisturbed." Eliza gazed out at the rain-streaked streets of London, the elegant townhouses and fashionable shops passing in a blur as their carriage rattled over the cobblestones. "I understand perfectly, Aunt," she replied, her voice steady despite the ache in her heart. "His Grace and I move in different worlds. It was foolish to imagine otherwise, even briefly." Lady Montgomery patted her hand with unexpected sympathy. "There will be other gentlemen, my dear. Perhaps not dukes, but respectable men who might appreciate your unique qualities." Eliza doubted this very much, but she nodded agreement, unwilling to pursue the painful subject. As they arrived at their modest townhouse, the rain intensified, driving them quickly indoors. Eliza retired to her room immediately, claiming fatigue, though sleep was far from her mind. Instead, she sat by her window, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass while her thoughts returned inevitably to Alexander. His presence at Mrs. Whitmore's salon could not have been coincidental. Had he sought her out specifically? And if so, for what purpose? To renew his addresses despite her rejection? Or perhaps to make a formal, final farewell, closing the chapter between them definitively? Either possibility brought fresh pain, and Eliza turned resolutely to her writing desk, where the half-completed manuscript of her botanical guide awaited. She would focus on this work, on creating something of lasting value from her knowledge and passion. It was not the future she had briefly allowed herself to dream of, but it was a purpose nonetheless, a way to move forward when happiness in the conventional sense seemed permanently beyond her reach. The following evening found Eliza once again at Mrs. Whitmore's literary salon, her presence there something of a surprise even to herself. Lady Montgomery had declared firmly at breakfast that they would attend a musical evening at the Pembrokes instead, but an unexpected migraine had confined her aunt to a darkened bedroom. Rebecca, eager for any social outing, had convinced Eliza that they might still attend the salon with only their maid as chaperone, arguing persuasively that the scholarly nature of Mrs. Whitmore's gatherings made them entirely proper, even without Lady Montgomery's supervision. In truth, Eliza had required little convincing. The salon represented one of the few social environments where she felt truly comfortable, valued for her knowledge rather than judged for her unmarried state. And if a small, secret part of her hoped for another glimpse of Alexander, she refused to acknowledge it even to herself. The elegant drawing room was already crowded when the Thornfield sisters arrived, the gathering larger than usual owing to the presence of a renowned naturalist newly returned from the Amazon basin. Eliza and Rebecca were warmly greeted by their hostess, who immediately drew Eliza into conversation with several guests interested in botanical pursuits. For nearly an hour, Eliza found herself pleasantly engaged in discussions of native versus exotic plant species, the conversation flowing naturally between scientific observation and practical application. The loud announcement of a new arrival barely registered until she noticed the sudden hush that fell over the room, followed by a wave of whispers that spread like ripples on a pond. The Duke of Ravencroft stood in the doorway, his tall figure commanding attention without effort. Unlike the previous evening, when he had been dressed with his usual impeccable formality, tonight he appeared almost disheveled by his exacting standards, his cravat slightly askew, his dark hair showing evidence of fingers run through it in agitation. Without pausing to greet Mrs. Whitmore or acknowledge the murmurs of surprise at his second consecutive appearance at her salon, Alexander scanned the room with obvious purpose. His gaze found Eliza almost immediately, and the intensity of his expression caused her breath to catch in her throat. For a moment, neither moved, the crowded room seeming to fall away as their eyes held across the distance. Then Alexander began to move toward her with long, determined strides, heedless of the startled expressions of those he passed. Conversation faltered, and then ceased entirely, as the assembled company became aware of the drama unfolding before them. By the time he reached her side, a circle of space had formed around them, guests drawing back with instinctive deference, yet remaining close enough to witness whatever was about to transpire between the Duke of Ravencroft and the spinster Miss Thornfield. "Miss Thornfield," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly in the now silent room, "I find I must speak with you on a matter of some urgency." Eliza stood perfectly still, her composure threatened by the barely contained emotion visible in his face. "Your Grace," she managed, acutely aware of the watching eyes and listening ears surrounding them. "Perhaps we might speak privately." Alexander shook his head, a gesture both decisive and somehow desperate. "No, Eliza. I have spent 3 weeks in private thought, in private agony. What I have to say cannot wait, nor do I wish it to remain private any longer." The assembled company seemed collectively to hold its breath as he took her hand in his, apparently oblivious to the breach of propriety or the whispers that immediately erupted at the gesture. "You once told me that society would never accept a duchess considered to be on the shelf," he continued, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "That whispers and judgment would make us both miserable. I have considered your words carefully, and I find them wholly unconvincing." A startled laugh escaped Eliza's lips before she could prevent it, the unexpectedness of his statement momentarily overriding her awareness of their audience. Alexander smiled briefly in response, his expression softening though his grip on her hand remained firm. "I care nothing for society's rules, Eliza," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone that nevertheless carried to every corner of the hushed room. "I have loved you since we were children, and I will love you until my last breath. Age, status, fortune, none of it matters. Only you." The directness of his declaration, spoken without reservation before the cream of London's intellectual society, struck Eliza speechless. Colour rose to her cheeks as whispers rippled through the room, expressions of shock, disapproval, and in some cases, unexpected delight at witnessing such an extraordinary scene. "For 3 weeks I have tried to imagine my life without you in it," Alexander continued, seemingly indifferent to the sensation he was causing. "I have attended to business, consulted with lawyers, reviewed investments, all the while knowing that none of it holds meaning without you beside me." His voice took on an edge of determination that Eliza recognized from their childhood, the tone he had used when arguing passionately for some cause he believed in utterly. "I will not allow fear, neither yours nor mine, to deprive us both of happiness. I will not bow to society's arbitrary rules about who may love whom, and I will not spend another day separated from the only woman who has ever truly seen me, not as the Duke of Ravencroft, but as Alexander, the boy who collected botanical specimens and argued about poetry, and found his heart's companion in a girl with extraordinary eyes and an even more extraordinary mind." Tears gathered in Eliza's eyes at the raw honesty of his words, spoken without reservation before witnesses who would undoubtedly carry every syllable to drawing rooms across London by morning. The enormity of what he was risking, the absolute defiance of convention his declaration represented, left her momentarily unable to respond. Alexander, sensing her hesitation, pressed on with gentle insistence. "If you truly do not share my feelings, I will trouble you no further." But if your rejection at Blackwood stemmed only from fear of society's censure, then I beg you to reconsider. Let them whisper if they must. Let them judge if they dare. We will build a life based on mutual respect and genuine affection, a partnership of minds and hearts that will outlast any temporary scandal. The room had grown so silent that the ticking of the mantel clock seemed thunderous by comparison. Every eye was fixed on Eliza, awaiting her response to this most unconventional proposal. Rebecca had moved to stand supportively at her sister's side, her expression a mixture of astonishment and barely concealed delight. Her Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps the only person present who seemed entirely unsurprised by the scene unfolding in her drawing room, nodded encouragingly from her position near the fireplace. Eliza took a deep breath, gathering her courage as she faced not only Alexander, but the assembled company whose judgment she had feared for so long. "What you suggest defies all convention," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Society will be merciless in its criticism of us both." Alexander smiled, a full, genuine expression that transformed his features and reminded her powerfully of the boy who had once been her dearest friend. "Then society may go hang," he replied simply. "I ask again, Eliza Thornfield, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, not despite society's objections, but in glorious defiance of them?" For what felt like an eternity but was in reality only seconds, Eliza stood motionless, poised between fear and hope, between the safe familiarity of resignation and the terrifying possibility of happiness. Then, with a clarity that felt like emerging from a long darkness into brilliant sunlight, she knew her answer. "Yes, Alexander," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I will marry you, with all the joy and defiance such a decision entails." The smile that illuminated his face at her acceptance was worth every whisper, every raised eyebrow, every potential slight they might face in the years ahead. In one fluid movement, he raised her hand to his lips, the gesture both formal and startlingly intimate in the context of their public declaration. A smattering of applause broke out, led by Professor Harlow, and enthusiastically joined by several other guests, while others looked on in shocked silence or whispered furiously behind raised fans. Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward, her expression one of genuine pleasure as she addressed the newly engaged couple. "I believe this calls for champagne," she announced, signaling to a footman who had been standing transfixed by the doorway. "After all, it isn't every day my humble salon witnesses the engagement of a duke to a distinguished botanist, an event which I, for one, find entirely appropriate and long overdue." The scandal of the Duke of Ravencroft's very public proposal to Miss Eliza Thornfield spread through London society with astonishing speed. By the following morning, enhanced versions of the scene at Mrs. Whitmore's salon had reached breakfast tables across Mayfair, each retelling more dramatic than the last. Some accounts claimed the Duke had fallen to his knees before the assembled company, while others insisted Miss Thornfield had burst into tears and thrown herself into his arms. Both versions equally shocking to those who considered themselves arbiters of proper behavior. Lady Montgomery, upon learning of the engagement from her nieces the previous evening, had cycled rapidly through disbelief, consternation, and finally a grudging acceptance tinged with unmistakable calculation. After all, regardless of the circumstances, her elder niece was to become a duchess, an outcome so advantageous it eventually outweighed even her rigid adherence to social convention. The Morning Post carried a formal announcement 2 days later, its simple statement of fact doing nothing to quell the speculation that dominated every drawing-room conversation from Belgravia to Bloomsbury. On Bond Street, Eliza and Rebecca found themselves the subject of undisguised scrutiny as they selected fabrics for the bridal trousseau, whispers following in their wake as they moved from one fashionable establishment to the next. In Gunter's tea shop, where they stopped for refreshment, a particularly bold matron stared openly at Eliza before turning to her companion with a sniff clearly meant to be overheard. 26, plain as a pippin, without fortune or extraordinary connections. One must assume the Duke has suffered some sort of brain fever. Her companion tittered behind her gloved hand. Or perhaps Miss Thornfield possesses talents of a more private nature that compensate for her deficiencies. Rebecca nearly rose from her chair in indignation, but Eliza placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Let them talk," she murmured, surprised to find that the cruel words affected her less than she had anticipated. "They cannot diminish what exists between Alexander and myself." Not every reaction proved hostile, however. When Eliza attended a meeting of the Royal Botanical Society later that week, escorted by Alexander himself in a clear statement of his intentions, she was approached by several members who offered sincere congratulations. Professor Harlow, in particular, seemed delighted by the match. "The Duke has shown exceptional wisdom in his choice," he declared loudly enough for all nearby to hear. "Miss Thornfield's monograph on native orchids demonstrates a scientific mind of the first order. Their shared intellectual interests make them perfectly suited, in my opinion." Alexander, standing at Eliza's side with his hand placed possessively at the small of her back, smiled with evident satisfaction at this endorsement. Even within the peerage, reactions were divided. Several of Alexander's colleagues in the House of Lords made a point of cutting him directly when he appeared for an important vote, turning their backs as he entered the chamber in a public display of disapproval. Yet the Duke of Wellington, whose opinion carried more weight than a dozen lesser peers combined, made a point of crossing the room to shake Alexander's hand. "About time you found someone who engages your intellect, Ravencroft," he said gruffly. "Saw her botanical illustrations at the Royal Society exhibition. Remarkable precision, good eye for detail. Important quality in a duchess." Through it all, Alexander remained steadfast in his devotion, appearing with Eliza at carefully selected social events where they might reasonably expect a civil reception while avoiding those gatherings where hostility would be assured. He escorted her openly to bookshops, scientific lectures, and art exhibitions, his manner making it clear to all observers that he considered her not a temporary infatuation, but his chosen life companion. In private moments, often stolen in the small drawing room at Lady Montgomery's townhouse where they were permitted brief periods of minimally chaperoned conversation, they spoke candidly about the challenges they faced and would continue to face. The Harrington dinner was particularly difficult, Eliza admitted one afternoon, referring to a recent event where several guests had made pointed remarks about appropriate matches for those of ducal rank. "I confess their barely concealed disdain affected me more than I wish it had." Alexander took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles in a gesture that had become familiar and deeply comforting. "They fear what they do not understand," he replied simply. "A marriage based on genuine affection and shared interests rather than calculation and advantage threatens the very foundation of their social order." His grey eyes held hers with unwavering certainty. "But we will prevail, Eliza. Already some begin to accept what they cannot change. In time, many more will follow." Eliza studied his face, the strong features she had come to know so well over the weeks since their engagement. "Do you never regret your choice?" she asked softly. "The loss of esteem among your peers, the whispers behind fans and raised eyebrows when we enter a room together." Alexander laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "My peers, as you call them, are for the most part narrow-minded, conventionally educated, and utterly predictable in their opinions. I value the respect of men like Wellington and Harlow far more than the approval of a dozen Lord Wexleys. As for society at large," he continued, raising her hand to his lips in a gesture that never failed to send a pleasant shiver through her body, "they will adapt, or they will not. Either way, we shall build a life together based on mutual respect and genuine affection, just as I promised that night at Mrs. Whitmore's." Gradually, Eliza began to believe him. When Lady Harrington, who had initially declared she would rather die than attend a wedding so utterly unsuitable, sent her acceptance to the wedding invitation with a note indicating her sincere good wishes, Eliza recognized the first evidence of society's grudging adjustment to what it could not prevent. When three young ladies of good family approached her at a musical evening to ask about her botanical studies, their interest appearing genuine rather than merely polite, she dared to hope that perhaps their unusual match might eventually be, if not fully approved, at least tolerated by the society whose judgment she had once feared so deeply. London might continue to buzz with the scandal of a duke marrying a spinster well past her prime, some mocking the match while others found it unexpectedly romantic. But Eliza discovered that the disapproval mattered less with each passing day. Alexander loved her, valued her mind, respected her as an equal partner. That certainty, growing stronger with each shared conversation and each public appearance where he stood proudly at her side, proved more powerful than any whisper or raised eyebrow could ever be. The weeks following Eliza's acceptance of Alexander's proposal passed in a flurry of preparations. While Lady Montgomery immersed herself in the details of wedding arrangements with unexpected enthusiasm, Alexander had been mysteriously absent from London for several days, citing estate business at Blackwood Manor. His letters during this separation had been affectionate but strangely evasive, mentioning a special project that required his personal supervision. When he finally returned to town, he immediately requested Eliza's presence at Blackwood the following day, insisting that Rebecca and Lady Montgomery accompany her to ensure perfect propriety. The carriage journey to Hampshire passed pleasantly, the gentle May sunshine having replaced April's persistent rains. Eliza found her spirits lifting with each mile that brought them closer to Blackwood, memories of her previous visit now tinged with joy rather than regret. Alexander awaited them at the entrance, his tall figure outlined against the ancient stone of the manor house. He greeted Lady Montgomery and Rebecca with courteous warmth, but his eyes never left Eliza as he took her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips. "I have something to show you," he murmured, his expression alight with barely contained excitement. "If you are not too fatigued from the journey." Eliza smiled up at him, curiosity piqued by the unusual animation in his normally composed features. "I am perfectly well," she assured him. "Please, do not keep me in suspense." Alexander offered his arm with formal correctness, though his eyes held a warmth that belied the gesture. "Ladies," he addressed Lady Montgomery and Rebecca, "if you would be so kind as to accompany us. While the staff prepares tea, I wish to show Eliza a small project I have undertaken in her absence." He guided them not toward the formal gardens that Eliza remembered from her previous visit, but along a path that wound through a stand of ancient oaks toward an area she had not explored before. As they rounded a gentle curve in the path, Alexander paused, watching Eliza's face with expectant delight. Before them stood a magnificent glasshouse, its graceful iron framework gleaming in the afternoon sun, crystal panes catching the light in dazzling patterns. It was far larger than the modest conservatory she had visited during her previous stay, its elegant proportions suggesting the work of a master architect. "Alexander has been most mysterious about this project," Rebecca whispered to her sister as they approached the structure. "He would tell us nothing except that it was a surprise for you." Eliza felt her heartbeat quicken as Alexander led them to the ornately wrought iron doors. With a gesture that combined ceremony with genuine pleasure, he swung them open and stood aside to allow her to enter first. The interior took her breath away. Unlike traditional conservatories designed primarily for display, this vast space had been created with scientific purpose in mind. Raised beds contained carefully arranged botanical specimens, organized not by decorative appeal, but by family and habitat. Stone pathways wound between the plantings, allowing close observation without disturbing the specimens. Specialized sections housed plants requiring particular conditions, from bog orchids to alpine species, each microclimate meticulously engineered. But it was the specimens themselves that brought tears to Eliza's eyes. Every native British orchid she had ever mentioned in their childhood correspondence or during their walks at Blackwood was represented, along with rare species she had only read about in botanical journals. "Welcome to the Thornfield Botanical Conservatory," Alexander said softly, watching her face as she turned slowly, taking in the magnificence of the creation. "I've spent the past weeks collecting specimens from across Britain and Europe, guided by our conversations and your particular interests." Lady Montgomery and Rebecca exchanged glances before the older woman tactfully suggested they might inspect the alpine section at the far end of the conservatory, leaving Eliza and Alexander in relative privacy near the entrance. "This is extraordinary," Eliza whispered, her fingers gently touching the delicate petals of a Cypripedium calceolus. the rare lady's slipper orchid they had discussed during their first morning walk at Blackwood. "You have created this for me?" Alexander nodded, taking her hands in his. "For us," he corrected gently. "This will be our sanctuary, Eliza, a place where we can pursue our shared passion without concern for society's opinions or judgments. Here, we will be simply Alexander and Eliza, as we were as children discovering the world together." He guided her to a central area where a particularly magnificent specimen of Orchis purpurea, the lady orchid, bloomed in solitary splendor. "I searched half of Kent for this one," he admitted with a smile. "Remembering how you mentioned it was the pride of your collection at Thornfield before you had to leave." Eliza touched the perfect blossom with reverent fingers, moved beyond words by the thoughtfulness and understanding the gesture represented. "You remembered," she said softly. "Every detail," Alexander replied, his voice deepening with emotion. "Every plant you mentioned, every dream you shared, every hope you expressed. When you feared that society would never accept our match, that whispers and judgment would make us both miserable, I determined to create a world where none of that matters, a place where we can be entirely ourselves." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box of aged leather, opening it to reveal a ring of extraordinary design. Rather than the traditional diamond solitaire, the central stone was an unusually large emerald, its deep green color reminiscent of the forest depths where native orchids thrived. Surrounding it were tiny seed pearls arranged in a pattern that subtly suggested flower petals. "Eliza Thornfield," he said, his voice steady though his eyes revealed the depth of his emotion. "I have asked for your hand before, but now I ask for your heart as well. Will you accept this ring as a symbol of our shared passion, our equal partnership, our mutual respect? Will you make this garden, this home, this life your own alongside me?" Eliza's vision blurred with tears as she looked from the ring to Alexander's face, and then to the extraordinary conservatory he had created as physical proof of his understanding and acceptance of her true self. All her previous doubts and fears seemed to fade into insignificance in the face of such tangible evidence of love. "You have created a world where we can be ourselves," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Yes, Alexander, I will be your Duchess. But more importantly, I will be your partner, your companion, your equal in all things that matter." Alexander slid the ring onto her finger, its weight unfamiliar but somehow right, like the culmination of a journey begun 15 years ago in these same gardens. From the far end of the conservatory came the sound of delighted applause as Rebecca and Lady Montgomery abandoned any pretense of examining alpine specimens. Alexander laughed, the sound echoing among the glass panes overhead as he drew Eliza into an embrace that was perhaps more demonstrative than strict propriety would allow, but entirely fitting for the unconventional couple they had become. "Let society whisper if they must," he murmured against her hair. "We have built something stronger than their judgment, more lasting than their approval. In this garden, in this life we will share, only truth and genuine feeling matter." Eliza raised her face to his, all doubt finally banished by the certainty of his love and the strength of her own. "Then let us begin as we mean to continue," she said softly, "true to ourselves and to each other, regardless of what the world might think." The afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass walls of the conservatory, illuminating the rare and precious specimens Alexander had gathered as testament to his understanding of her deepest passions. But more beautiful than any exotic bloom was the knowledge that in Alexander she had found someone who saw her completely, valued her precisely as she was, and loved her without reservation or condition. Whatever challenges awaited them beyond the crystalline walls of their sanctuary, they would face them together, equal partners in defiance of convention. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself approved of the union about to take place. Unlike the elaborate ceremonies traditionally expected for a duke's marriage, Alexander and Eliza had chosen to keep their wedding intimate, with only those friends and family members who had demonstrated genuine support for their unconventional match. The small chapel at Blackwood Manor, rarely used since Alexander's father's time, had been transformed under Eliza's careful direction. Instead of the traditional floral arrangements, potted specimens of native orchids and rare ferns lined the ancient stone walls, their delicate beauty enhanced by the sunlight streaming through stained glass windows that had witnessed Ravencroft weddings for centuries. The effect was both reverent and deeply personal, a perfect representation of the couple's shared passion. In her chamber in the East Wing, Eliza stood before the mirror as Rebecca and her maid made final adjustments to her wedding gown. Rather than the expected white satin adorned with orange blossoms, she had chosen a dress of pale green silk, its subtle hue reminiscent of new leaves in spring. The bodice and hem were embellished with exquisite embroidery, depicting various botanical specimens significant to her relationship with Alexander, each rendered with scientific accuracy yet arranged with artistic grace. The lady's slipper orchid they had discussed during their first morning walk, the pressed gentian that had fallen from the book in his library, and dozens of other plants that had marked important moments in their journey together, created a living history of their love. Her chestnut hair was arranged simply, adorned only with a coronet of tiny white woodland flowers gathered that morning from the Blackwood estate. The overall effect was unconventional, yet undeniably beautiful, as uniquely Eliza as the man who awaited her at the altar. "Are you nervous?" Rebecca asked, adjusting the delicate veil of antique lace that had belonged to their mother. Eliza smiled, touching the emerald ring that had not left her finger since Alexander had placed it there in the conservatory. "Not about marrying Alexander," she replied thoughtfully. "We have faced society's disapproval and emerged stronger for it. Today merely formalizes what we have already proven to be true, that love based on mutual respect and shared passion can withstand even the most stringent opposition." Lady Montgomery entered the room, resplendent in lavender silk, and clearly determined to present a dignified front despite the modest scale of the proceedings. "The guests are assembled," she announced, her tone suggesting she still found the limited attendance somewhat disappointing. Though the Duke of Wellington's presence certainly lends appropriate gravity to the occasion, the walk to the chapel took them through the gardens where Eliza and Alexander had first reconnected as adults. As they approached the ancient stone building, the soft notes of a string quartet drifted through the open doors. Rebecca squeezed her sister's hand before taking her place as the only bridesmaid, leaving Eliza alone with her uncle, Lord Prescott, who had agreed to give her away in her father's absence. The music changed, signaling their entrance, and Eliza took a deep breath before stepping through the doorway into her future. The chapel's interior glowed with natural light, enhanced by dozens of candles. The assembled guests, though few in number, represented quality rather than quantity, intelligent men and women who had recognized the genuine connection between the bride and groom and chosen to support rather than condemn their match. Professor Harlow beamed from his position in the front pew, while the Duke of Wellington maintained a gruff dignity that could not quite disguise his approval. But it was Alexander, standing tall and proud at the altar, who commanded Eliza's complete attention as she moved slowly down the aisle. His expression as he watched her approach held such naked adoration that she felt tears threatening to spill. This man, this remarkable man who had defied convention and risked censure to claim her as his equal partner, now waited to bind his life to hers before God and these witnesses. When Lord Prescott placed her hand in Alexander's, the warmth of his fingers closing around hers seemed to symbolize everything they had fought for: the right to choose according to their hearts rather than society's dictates. The ceremony itself was traditional in structure, but personalized in content. The vicar, a scholarly man who had known Alexander since childhood, spoke eloquently of partnerships based on mutual respect and shared purpose. The couple had written their own vows, another departure from convention that raised eyebrows among the more traditional guests, but delighted those who understood the significance of the gesture. "I take you, Eliza, as my wife and equal partner," Alexander said, his voice steady and clear. "I promise to value your mind as well as your heart, to support your pursuits as fervently as my own, and to build with you a life where we both may flourish as our true selves." Regardless of what the world might think or say, Eliza's response, equally heartfelt, brought tears to Rebecca's eyes, and a surprising moisture to the Duke of Wellington's as well. "I take you, Alexander, as my husband and truest friend. I promise to stand beside you in all endeavors, to share both burdens and joys with equal commitment, and to love you not for your title or position, but for the man I have known since childhood, whose heart and mind have captured mine completely." When Alexander placed the wedding ring on her finger to join her engagement ring, the two bands seemed to symbolize their journey, the emerald representing their shared passion for knowledge and discovery, the simple gold band, their commitment to a future built on trust and mutual devotion. Their first kiss, as husband and wife, was brief but tender, appropriate to the setting yet charged with promise for the private celebration to follow. The string quartet struck up a triumphant melody as they turned to face their guests. No longer Miss Thornfield and the Duke of Ravencroft, but Alexander and Eliza, husband and wife, partners in defiance of convention and creators of their own traditions. As they processed back down the aisle, arm in arm, Eliza caught sight of the orchids lining the walls, rare and beautiful specimens that thrived, despite challenging circumstances, just as their love had flourished against all expectations. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty they had created together and supported by those who truly saw and valued them, Eliza knew with absolute certainty that they had chosen correctly, risking temporary scandal for the chance at lasting happiness. 2 years after their wedding, Blackwood Manor hummed with activity as final preparations were completed for the botanical exhibition scheduled to open the following day. The Thornfield Botanical Conservatory, once Alexander's private gift to his bride, had expanded to become a center for scientific study that attracted naturalists from across Europe. Eliza moved through the main gallery, where display cases housed rare specimens and detailed illustrations, her practiced eye noting details that required adjustment, her hand occasionally resting on the gentle swell of her abdomen, where their first child grew. Her pregnancy, now in its 5th month, had brought a new glow to her features and a deeper contentment to her already happy marriage. The publication of Thornfield and Ravencroft's Guide to Native British Orchids, 6 months earlier, had established the couple as serious contributors to botanical science rather than mere enthusiasts. The scholarly work, combining Eliza's meticulous observations with Alexander's artistic renderings, had received accolades from the Royal Society and was already being used as a reference text at Oxford. More significantly, it represented the true partnership they had created, their names appearing as equal collaborators on the title page, another convention defied without apology. Lady Montgomery, visiting Blackwood for the exhibition opening, approached with an elderly gentleman in tow. "Eliza, my dear," she said with the proprietary air she had adopted since her niece's elevation to Duchess, "Professor Collins is most eager to discuss your monograph on propagation techniques. He finds your methods quite revolutionary." Eliza greeted the professor warmly, engaging him in conversation about the specific challenges of cultivating ladies' slipper orchids from seed. As they spoke, she noticed Lady Pembroke enter the gallery with several other members of the ton, whose initial disdain for the match had gradually transformed into reluctant curiosity and finally genuine interest as the Duke and Duchess of Ravencroft's scientific achievements gained recognition. Lady Pembroke herself, once the most vocal critic of their marriage, now made a point of claiming prior acquaintance with the Duchess at every opportunity, conveniently forgetting her cruel remarks at the Blackwood ball. Alexander appeared at Eliza's side, smoothly joining the botanical discussion while placing a supportive hand at the small of her back. A habitual gesture of affection he had never abandoned, despite its impropriety in formal settings. His presence still affected her as powerfully as it had during their first reunion at Blackwood, though the initial intensity had mellowed into a deeper, more comfortable intimacy. When the last guests had been shown to their rooms and preparations for the exhibition completed to their satisfaction, Eliza and Alexander escaped to their private garden, a secluded space accessible only from their personal chambers. The setting sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, casting long shadows across the carefully tended beds where experimental crossbreeding of native orchids was producing remarkable results. They walked in companionable silence for a time, hands linked in the easy familiarity of a marriage built on genuine affection and mutual respect. "Society has certainly changed its tune," Eliza observed as they paused beside a reflecting pool where water lilies floated on the still surface. Lady Pembroke could scarcely have been more effusive in her praise of our work, considering she once referred to me as desperate and past my prime. Alexander laughed, the sound still possessing the power to warm her heart after 2 years of marriage. "The ton always follows success," he replied, drawing her closer to his side. "Had we failed, had our marriage proved unhappy, or our work insignificant, they would still whisper behind their fans. But no one can deny that we have built something meaningful together, something neither of us could have achieved alone." Eliza smiled, leaning into his embrace as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the garden in the gentle blue light of early evening. The child within her stirred, and she guided Alexander's hand to rest against the spot where their baby had kicked. His expression as he felt the movement was one of wonder and profound love. "2 years ago, I defied convention to marry a woman society deemed unsuitable," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "Today, we stand respected for our work, secure in our happiness, and awaiting the arrival of our child. I believe we have thoroughly disproved Lady Pembroke's assessment of our prospects." "Indeed," Eliza agreed, turning within the circle of his arms to face him fully. "Though I sometimes wonder what might have happened had I not hidden behind those curtains during your meeting with the aristocrats, had I never overheard your confession that there was only one woman you had ever considered as your duchess." Alexander smiled, the expression transforming his handsome features in the gathering twilight. "I would have found another way to tell you," he assured her. "Some truths cannot remain unspoken, no matter how many social conventions stand in their way." He placed his hand gently against her rounded belly, his eyes reflecting both tenderness for the child growing within and enduring love for the woman who carried it. "You were always worth waiting for, Eliza," he whispered. "The fortune of finding you again after 15 years, of building this life, this work, this family together, far outweighs any temporary scandal or social disapproval." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky above them, Eliza and Alexander returned slowly to the house where guests awaited and responsibilities called. Yet in that private garden, as in their hearts, they had created a world where true connection flourished regardless of society's expectations or judgments, where love based on mutual respect and shared passion had proven stronger than convention, and where two people who had once been unlikely friends as children had become even more unlikely partners as adults, defying prediction and creating their own definition of happiness. Dear listener, as the final notes of our story fade away, perhaps you find yourself lingering in the warmth of Eliza and Alexander's journey. Their tale reminds us that society's judgments, though powerful, need not determine our path or define our worth. In a world that often values appearance over substance and convention over connection, Eliza and Alexander chose to see beyond these limitations. They recognized in each other something far more precious than social approval, a genuine understanding of the other's true self. Like Eliza, you may have felt the sting of being overlooked or undervalued for qualities that society does not readily celebrate. Perhaps you've hidden parts of yourself that didn't fit neatly into others' expectations. Or like Alexander, you may have maintained a careful facade, afraid to show vulnerability in a world that equates it with weakness. Their story whispers an essential truth. Authentic connection, whether in love or friendship, begins when we have the courage to be fully ourselves and the wisdom to recognize that same authenticity in others. The bond formed through such recognition has a strength that superficial connections can never match. Remember that your worth is not diminished by others' failure to see it. The qualities that make you unique, your passions, your intellect, your perspective, are treasures waiting to be discovered by those with the vision to truly see you. And if you're fortunate enough to find someone who values you precisely as you are, who sees beyond society's narrow definitions to the person beneath, cherish that connection. Like the rare orchids in Eliza's conservatory, such relationships require care and nurturing, but they reward us with beauty that far outshines more common blooms. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you the knowledge that your story, like Eliza's, is still being written. Whatever chapter you're in now does not determine the ending. The courage to remain true to yourself and to value substance over appearance in others may lead to happiness as unexpected and profound as that found within the walls of Blackwood Manor. Rest well, dear listener, and may you find both the courage to be seen and the wisdom to truly see others.